She came to Harlan County with $11, a broken clasp on her travel bag, and a letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The man who wrote it hadn't promised her anything except work and a roof and fair dealing. The orchard he described was 22 acres of apple trees, outside a town called Copperfield, Oregon, and the way he wrote about it, flat, without sentiment, the way a man writes when he has stopped expecting things to go well, told her more than the words did. She had answered it because she had run out of other answers. Nobody at the Copperfield depot was expecting much from her arrival. She could tell from the way the station master looked at her bag, then at her face, then away. She was 29 years old, and she had been a bookkeeper in Portland until the firm closed. And before that, she had spent 3 summers helping her uncle run his nursery operation in the Willamette Valley, learning more about root systems and blight and the particular stubbornness of fruit trees than she had ever expected to need. Her name was Willa Fenn, and she had learned early that the most useful thing she could do in any new situation was keep her mouth shut and watch. The man waiting for her at the far end of the platform was not what she had pictured. He was older than his letter had read. Somewhere past 50, she thought, though the outdoor life made ages hard to judge. With the careful, compressed posture of someone carrying weight they had decided a long time ago not to put down. His name was Boyd Straker. He had a daughter of 12 named June, who stood slightly behind him, with her arms folded and her eyes on the ground, and who did not look up when Willa approached. Boyd shook her hand once, firmly, without the performance of warmth. He looked at her directly for a moment, taking some kind of inventory, and then he looked past her at the platform. "1 bag," he said. It wasn't a question. "1 bag," she said. He picked it up before she could and walked toward a wagon that had seen better decades. June had still not looked at her. Willa fell into step and decided not to require anything from either of them that they weren't offering. The drive to the property took 40 minutes on a road that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be mud or gravel, and had settled on something worse than either. Boyd did not fill the silence. June sat between them with her shoulders pulled in, and Willa watched the country open around them as they climbed away from town. The valley floor gave way to foothills, and the foothills to the particular kind of mixed terrain that exists in the western part of the state where the mountains decide to let the rain through. The light in late September came in low and gold and thin. "How many bearing trees?" Willa asked. Boyd turned his head slightly. 412. Give or take what the late frost took in April. Varieties. Another small pause, this one with a different quality. Mostly Newtown pippin. Some Gravenstein near the upper fence. My father planted them. June was looking at Willa now. Just briefly, a child taking a precise, careful measurement. "The Gravensteins will be past," Willa said, "but the pippins should still have 3-4 weeks." Boyd said nothing. She could feel him adding something to whatever accounting he was running. The orchard came into view on the left side of the road. Even from the wagon, even in the diminished light of late afternoon, she could see the problem. The trees were there, 400 and more of them, heavy with unpicked fruit, the rows running up the hillside in the orderly pattern of a grandfather's careful work. But the grass between the rows was knee-high, and the lower branches of the nearest trees were dragging the ground with the weight of fruit nobody had gotten to. And on a dozen trees, she could see the dark patches of codling moth damage even from this distance. "You're behind on harvest," she said. "I know it." His voice was flat, not defensive, just the tone of a man who already knew the exact dimensions of his problem and was tired of knowing them. "How many pickers do you have?" "2. One's older than the trees. The other one, I'm not sure, will show up tomorrow." The house appeared past a stand of Douglas fir, a white 2-story building that had been well made and was now being outlasted by the weather in the way these things went if nobody stayed ahead of it. The porch was sound. The windows were clean. The kitchen garden beside the house had been put to bed for the season with more care than the orchard had received, which told her something about where the available attention had been going, and perhaps about who had been providing it. June climbed down from the wagon before it fully stopped and went into the house without speaking. Boyd carried Willa's bag to the porch. He set it down and turned to look at the orchard, at the heavy unpicked rows climbing the hillside. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and the set of his jaw was the one she would come to recognize as Boyd Straker reckoning with something he had not yet decided how to address. My wife managed most of the harvest coordination, he said. She knew the buyers, she knew the schedule, she kept the pickers organized. She died 14 months ago. I'm sorry, Willa said. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because you need to understand what's missing, and I don't want to spend time explaining around it. She looked at him. All right, the room is off the back hallway. June will show you. He picked up her bag again and brought it inside, and she followed him into a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and something baked that morning. And she understood from looking at it. The dishes stacked neatly, the floor swept, the canned goods in the pantry arranged by size. That June Straker was doing the work of an adult in this household, and had been for longer than was fair. Her room was small and faced the orchard. She unpacked her bag in the thin evening light, and then she sat at the edge of the bed with her journal open to a fresh page and wrote the date and the location, the same way she always had, since she was 15 and her mother had told her to keep track of things because memory alone was not enough. She wrote, "The trees are salvageable, the operation is not. Not yet, but the starting material is there." She paused. The man does not talk to cover the silence. The girl is watching everything. She paused again. $11. She closed the journal and went to help with dinner, because it was the only thing she could do that night that would actually matter. Dawn came with a fog that sat in the low parts of the orchard and burned off slowly. Willa was outside before either of them, walking the rows with mud on her boots by 6 in the morning, making notes on the pad she'd taken from her bag. She moved tree by tree in the upper section, checking for damage, grading what she could see. The pippins near the top of the hill were in the best condition, which made sense. Better drainage, more airflow, further from the deer that had gotten through the fence on the east side at some point and walked off with 10 trees worth of early drops. When Boyd came out of the barn at 6:30, he found her at the fence on the east side, looking at the break. 3 rails down, she said without turning around. The grass is pressed flat going east. They've been through here more than once. I know. If you fix it today, we keep what's left on those rows. If we wait, I said I know. He came to stand beside her and look at the fence. His face in the morning light was older than it had been in the afternoon. Men like him always looked older in the morning. I've been one person trying to do the work of 4. I know what I haven't gotten to. She looked at him directly. I'm not making an accusation. I'm telling you what the order of operations is. He looked back at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. Fence first, he said. Fence first, she agreed. Then I want to talk to your pickers. The one who showed up that morning was a broad, slow-moving man named Russell who had been picking this orchard for 11 years. And who looked at Willa with the particular wariness of someone who had watched temporary arrangements come and go and did not invest in them. She shook his hand and asked him which rows he'd been working, and what his daily count ran, and whether he was getting help moving the bins to the cold shed. He told her. He answered more than she asked. Actually, once he understood that she was asking because she wanted to know the answers, and not because she was performing competence. The bins are the problem, he said. Boyd's been handling them himself after I leave, and he's wearing down. The count's been dropping because we can't pick faster than we can move what we've got. What time do you finish? 4 usually. Sometimes 3:30. I'll move the bins from noon on, she said. You and Boyd keep picking. I'll keep the floor clear. Russell looked at her for a moment. You've done harvest work. Some, she said. Not apples specifically. I learn fast. He nodded once in the slow, considered way of a man who had been given information he was going to verify before he decided what to do with it, which was the right approach, and she respected him for it. That first week was physical in a way she hadn't fully prepared for. Not the lifting, she had expected that, but the sustained, repetitive, all-day grinding nature of it. Moving bins, checking grades, sorting culls, keeping the lanes clear between the rows so the picking went smoothly. Her back told her things by Wednesday that she filed away and did not act on because there was no time and because stopping would make it worse, not better. June appeared in the orchard on Thursday afternoon. She came without announcement, without asking, and picked up an empty bin and began working the low branches of the nearest tree with the practiced efficiency of a child who had done this before she was tall enough to reach the middle branches. Willa watched her for a moment. You're good at that, she said. I know, June said. She didn't look up. Her hands kept moving. Willa went back to her bins. On Friday evening, after Russell had gone and Boyd was in the barn doing the end-of-day rounds, Willa sat at the kitchen table with the harvest records. She'd asked Boyd for them on the second morning, and he'd handed over a green cloth ledger without ceremony, the way a man hands over something he's glad to, not have to look at himself. She'd been reading them in pieces between work, getting the shape of the thing. Now she sat with the full picture in front of her, and what she was seeing did not make sense. The Copperfield Fruit Exchange had been buying the Straker crop for 9 years. That was the main buyer, the one who came through in harvest season and offered a price and took the lot. Willa had seen the packing shed figures, had counted the trees herself now, had talked to Russell about the yield history. She knew what premium Newtown pippin ran at the Portland market. She knew what the canneries paid for processing grade. She had helped her uncle sell fruit for 3 years and had done the arithmetic of it until it was part of how she thought. The numbers in this ledger were not right. Not variation in a bad year, not right. Wrong in a direction that never changed, year over year, pointing the same way every time. The exchange had been buying the Straker fruit at processing grade prices on what she was now sure was a premium grade crop. She went through it twice. Then a third time, making her own column in pencil. The difference, conservatively, over 9 years, was a number that sat in the kitchen air and was heavy enough to change the temperature of the room. She didn't show it to Boyd that night. She had learned something about this man in 5 days that she was going to need to remember. He absorbed hard information better in the morning, and he needed to have looked at it himself before he talked about it. And if she came to him with the ledger in the evening, after a long day he would hear the information, but it would land in exhaustion rather than clarity, and that was not the right place for it to land. She wrote it all out in her own hand in her notebook. Every year, every figure, the gap between what the exchange had paid and what the fruit was worth. She wrote it in the same plain accounting language her uncle had taught her, without editorializing, because the numbers said enough on their own. In the morning, she put it on the table beside his coffee. He read it in silence. He was a slow reader of important things. She had noticed, which was not a sign of difficulty but of thoroughness, the kind of person who reread rather than moving on before they were ready. He turned the page. He went back to the first column. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the orchard where the fog was still sitting in the low places. The exchange grader sets the category, he said. His voice was even. I know. Amos Lyle has been the grader for 8 years. He stopped. He's done business with this valley for a long time. I know that too, Willa said. I'm not saying I have it entirely right. The crop varies year to year. The market varies. There are transportation costs that run higher some years. I've accounted for all of that in the right column. She tapped the page. The gap that's left doesn't have an explanation I can find. Boyd looked at the numbers. She could see something working in his jaw that she had not seen before. Marianne handled this, he said. She did the grading conversations. She knew Lyle, they'd argue. She'd push back if she thought the grade was wrong. He paused. After she died, I took what he offered. I didn't have the capacity to fight about it. You weren't fighting about it before. She was. He looked up at her. That's not a criticism, Willa said. That's why you had a partner. He was quiet for a long moment. He set the notebook down, but he did not close it. Where are you getting your comparison figures? Oregon State Agricultural Extension Bulletin. October issue. I picked it up at the post office yesterday while I was in for the mail. She paused, and from my uncle's records. He ran a nursery operation in the Willamette Valley for 12 years. I kept his accounts. Boyd looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the road when she'd asked about the Gravensteins. The same recalibration. The letter didn't say anything about accounts. You asked for someone who could help with the harvest and the household. I can do both. The accounts came with me at no extra charge. Something shifted around his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough to one that she noted it. He closed the notebook and stood up. Lyle comes through for the final lot in 11 days, he said. He'll set the grade for the pippin bin we've got left, and what comes in from the upper rows this week. Good, she said. That gives us 11 days. He looked at her. To do what? She turned to the next page of her notebook, where she had already begun. To have documentation he can't argue with. The 11 days were the hardest stretch of work she had ever done that was not manual labor. It was both things at once. The continuing harvest, which did not pause for anything, and the parallel work of building a case that was airtight enough to stand up to a man who had been setting his own terms for the better part of a decade. She wrote to the State Agricultural Extension in Corvallis for current price tables. She wrote to a packing cooperative in Hood River that she'd found mentioned in the Extension Bulletin, asking about their buyer terms and their grading standards. She made Russell grade 12 bins of pippins with her watching, calling each apple out loud, and she recorded everything in her notebook and cross-referenced it against what Lyle had called comparable lots in his records from the previous 2 years. June watched all of it, not intrusively. The girl had the quality of making herself invisible while being entirely present, which Willa recognized as a survival skill and did not comment on. But she was there, at the edge of the kitchen table in the evenings when Willa was working through the figures. She asked questions sometimes, careful ones. Why does the grade matter if the apple looks the same? Why would someone do that if it wasn't fair? What happens if he says the numbers are wrong? Willa answered each one honestly. The grade matters because it determines the price, and the price is the difference between the orchard making money or not. He does it because he can, and because nobody was checking. If he says the numbers are wrong, we show him which numbers and let him explain the discrepancy. June turned that last one over for a moment. He might get angry, she said. He might, Willa said, but his anger is his problem. Ours is making sure we know what we're talking about before he gets here. Boyd was in the kitchen when she said it. She didn't know how long he'd been standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just went to the stove and poured his coffee, and sat down and picked up the figure sheet she'd been working on, and started reading it the way he read everything important. Slowly from the beginning, twice. On the 9th evening, after June was in bed, he came to the table where Willa was doing final checks on her documentation. He set a folded letter down beside her notebook. I wrote to a man I know in Medford, he said. He runs an apple operation twice the size of this one. Sells to the Hood River Cooperative. She looked at the letter. 21 cents a pound on pippin, Boyd said. His voice was flat in the way it got when he was keeping something even by force. Premium grade. Last fall. Willa looked up from the letter. Lyle has been paying us 12, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the upper rows of the orchard. A branch tapped against the window glass. For how many years? She said. 9. He sat down across from her. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. I didn't know. Marianne knew it was low. She always said Lyle was a hard negotiator and that we were getting fair to low. I thought that meant the market was just. He stopped. I thought it meant we were unlucky. You weren't unlucky, she said. No. He picked up his coffee cup and held it and didn't drink from it. How much? She had the figure on the next page. She turned the notebook to face him. The number was not the kind of number that left room for interpretation. He looked at it for a long time. That's 9 years, she said. That's what the orchard should have earned and didn't. He set the cup down. He was looking at the table, and his jaw was doing the thing she'd learned to read, the controlled pressure of a man who was keeping himself very still because the alternative was something he didn't want to do in front of someone else. She did not look away, because looking away would have been the wrong response. He was not a man who needed to be protected from the truth by someone else's discomfort. After a while, he said, Lyle comes day after tomorrow. I'll be there, she said. He looked up. You sure? I'm sure. He nodded once. He took the notebook and sat with it at the other end of the table for another hour, going through everything she'd prepared, turning pages back and forth, making a mark here and there in the margin with the pencil she'd left in the spine. She let him work. When he finally put it down, he said, without looking up, You didn't have to do all this. I'm trying to understand how the operation works, she said. This is part of how it works, or how it hasn't been working. He looked at her then. The lamp was between them and the light was low and steady. You've been here 9 days. I know. You found something that… He stopped. The information was in the ledger, she said. I just looked at it from the outside. He was quiet for a moment longer. Thank you, he said. It came out plainly, without performance. The way thanks came from people for whom it wasn't a social reflex, but an actual thing. She went to bed and lay awake for a while, looking at the ceiling, not thinking about the meeting with Lyle, but about the shape of the operation underneath the problem. The trees were good trees. The land was good land. Boyd Straker knew how to keep an orchard alive, had done it for years in conditions that should have broken the thing more than once. And if the numbers had been anything close to fair, the debts she'd seen in the ledger would not be there. That was not a small thing to know. That was the beginning of something different. Amos Lyle arrived the next morning in a clean wagon pulled by one horse, a man in his 60s with a grader's assessing eye and the ease of someone who had been the most comfortable person in every transaction he'd ever entered. He shook Boyd's hand in the yard with the warmth of long acquaintance. He looked at Willa with the particular look she'd been getting in Copperfield, not unkind but distinctly organized around the assumption that she was there for a purpose that did not include this conversation. "New help?" he said to Boyd. "This is Willa Fenn," Boyd said. "She's managing the harvest and the accounts." Lyle took that in. "Good to have help," he said, the way people said things when they were not sure what the thing meant yet. They walked the bins. This was standard. The grader walked the lot before setting price, which was reasonable and expected, and Willa had wanted him to see the bins because she had nothing to hide in them. The fruit was what it was, and what it was good. Lyle moved along the rows of sorted bins with the practiced eye of a man who had done this for decades. He pulled samples, rolled them in his palm, checked skin and core, held a few up to the light coming through the shed door. He was thorough. She gave him that. "Good lot this year," he said finally. He turned to Boyd. "Clean clip, strong size. Your management is holding up, thank you," Boyd said. His voice was even in the careful way she'd come to recognize. "I can do 13 cents a pound on the pippins," Lyle said. 11 on the culls, which is fair given the moth damage I'm seeing on the shoulder lot. Willa opened her notebook. "The Oregon Extension's current table for premium-grade Newtown pippin is 20 to 22 cents, she said. "We have a written offer from the Hood River Cooperative at 21 cents, no conditions." "You just described this as a good lot with clean fruit and strong size. That's a premium-grade description." Lyle looked at her. The goodwill expression stayed in place, but it was working harder than it had been a moment ago. "The market varies, Miss Fenn," she said. "And yes, it does. I've accounted for transportation and handling in our comparison figures. The gap after those costs is 8 cents a pound." She turned the notebook to face him and set it on the nearest bin. "That's the comparison for this year. These are the figures for the past 8 years. She turned to the next page. "The gap runs the same direction every year." Lyle looked at the notebook. He did not pick it up. Boyd said, "Look at the numbers, Amos." Lyle looked. He took longer than he needed to, and she recognized that as a man searching for the angle rather than reading figures for the first time. He knew what the figures said. He had always known. "Transport costs have been higher this decade," he said. "The rail rates are public record," Willa said. "I have the Willamette Southern Freight Table for the past 5 years in the back of this notebook. The rate change accounts for about 1.5 cents. The gap I'm showing is 8. Lyle set down the apple he was holding. He looked at Boyd in the way men looked at other men when they wanted to renegotiate the terms of a conversation that had gone sideways. "Boyd," he said, and his voice had dropped to the register of old acquaintance, of shared history, of 20 years of transactions before this woman arrived. "We've done business a long time." "We have," Boyd said, "and I'd like to keep doing business. But not at these prices." Lyle's expression moved through several things. She watched it. Not surprised, not looking for an argument anymore. Something closer to a man who had been building his operation on the assumption that no one was paying attention, and who had just understood that the assumption no longer held. 18 cents, he said. "That's the best I can do, and stay profitable." 20, Willa said. 21 on the premium bin. Those are the cooperative's terms. You're competing with them. I can't match a cooperative's buying power. "You're not being asked to match their buying power," she said. "You're being asked to pay fair market for the fruit. There's documentation on both sides of this. If you'd like to go through it line by line, I have time." Lyle looked at her for a long moment. The assessment in his eyes had changed quality, not dismissive now, something more careful. The look of someone who had underestimated a situation and was catching up to that fact. He looked at Boyd. "Your wife drives a hard." "She's not my wife," Boyd said. "She's the woman who keeps the accounts, and she knows what the fruit is worth." Lyle exhaled slowly. 20 cents, he said, "on the premium grade. 18 on the standard, 20 on premium," Willa said. 19 on standard. "And that rate holds for next year's contract, not just this lot." Another long pause. Outside, the wind came through the orchard and moved the remaining fruit on the unpicked trees in the upper rows. Next year, too, Lyle said at last. It came out flat, the tone of someone accepting something rather than agreeing to it. Yes, Willa said. Next year's, too. He signed the bill of sale she'd already drafted, and he signed the 1-year rate confirmation she had prepared, and which she suspected he hadn't expected to exist. He left 2 hours later, with the same clean wagon and the same matched horse. And she watched the road until the wagon was out of sight, and then she went into the packing shed and stood in the quiet for a minute and let her hands be unsteady in a way she hadn't allowed while he was there. Boyd came in behind her. 412 trees, he said, at 20 cents instead of 13. Yes. He stood in the shed doorway looking at the stacked bins. The afternoon light came through the high windows in the long, low angles of October. That's the difference in keeping this place, he said. It came out quiet, almost to himself. That's not a small thing. No, she said. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how did you know to look? I kept my uncle's accounts for 3 years, she said. He used to say that the numbers tell you what's happening if you're willing to actually look at what they say instead of what you want them to say. She paused. The ledger was there. I just read it. He nodded slowly. The afternoon was getting long. From somewhere outside, June's voice carried, high and clear, calling to something in the upper pasture that might have been one of the barn cats, or might have been nothing at all. He looked at Willa, and the look was direct in the way his looks were direct, without calculation. Thank you, he said again, still rusty, still real. The money arrived from Lyle by bank draft 10 days later. Boyd set it on the kitchen table after breakfast, and they both sat with it for a moment in the way you sat with something that had weight. He said, without ceremony, feed debt first. He had a list already. Then the note on the equipment shed. What's left goes to reserves. Willa had her own column in her notebook, which she turned to face him. His list and hers matched almost entirely, which she did not say out loud, but noted. After the debt's clear, she said, the operation has enough margin to get through to the next harvest without borrowing. He looked at her column. First time in 4 years that's been true. Yes. June came in from outside, still wearing her coat, mud on her boots. She looked at the bank draft on the table, and then at her father, and then at Willa. Is that from Mr. Lyle, she said. Yes, Boyd said. Is it the right amount this time? A pause. Boyd and Willa looked at each other. Yes, Willa said. It's the right amount. June pulled off her muddy boots at the door and set them on the mat. Good, she said, with the compressed satisfaction of a 12-year-old who had absorbed more of what was happening in this household than any adult had realized, and she went upstairs without another word. Boyd watched the stairs after she'd gone. Something moved in his face, quiet and complicated, the face of a man looking at evidence of what his child had been carrying and what she had been carrying it in silence for. She knew, he said. Children always know, Willa said. She began putting the harvest records in order in the desk drawer, and he sat at the table with his list, and the morning went on around them. November came gray and fast. The harvest was finished. The trees stood bare in the long rows, with the cold coming off the hills, and the packing shed was empty and clean, and the operation had shifted into the maintenance pace of the off-season. There was fencing to check, pruning to plan, equipment to winterize, work that did not go away, but which ran at a different tempo than the driven urgency of picking season. Willa learned the orchard in a different way in November. She walked the rows in the gray mornings, checking root crowns, noting which trees had fire blight damage that would need cutting back before spring, watching how the drainage ran after rain and where it sat too long, and what that was likely to cost in root health if it wasn't addressed. She had been reading the extension bulletins by lamplight in the evenings. Boyd had a stack of them going back 3 years that had been neatly organized by Mary Ann and then not touched since. She reorganized the pantry. She did not touch the photograph on the parlor wall. A woman in a dark dress standing at the edge of the orchard, not looking at the camera, but at the trees, with the expression of someone who loved the specific thing they were standing near. Some things in a house were structural, and she had no intention of disturbing them. She began to understand June in the way you understood a person when the performance was over and the ordinary days set in. The girl was precise. She was thorough. She had an observational memory that was startling. She remembered the exact count of damaged trees on the east row, remembered which bin Russell had noted as borderline grade, remembered things that had been said weeks earlier as if they were still sitting in front of her. She got herself up in the mornings and made her own breakfast, and did her school lessons at the kitchen table, with a concentration that required no management. One evening in mid-November, Willa was mending a tear in her work jacket by the parlor lamp, when June came in and sat on the rug with a book she wasn't reading, which was the way she sat when she wanted to say something, but hadn't found the beginning of it yet. Willa kept mending. After a while, June said, "My mother did the accounts." "I know," Willa said. She learned from her father. He ran a dry goods store in Salem. A pause. "She taught me some of it. Adding columns, keeping a running total. She said everyone should know how the money works. She was right about that." June turned the book over in her hands. "I've been keeping a list," she said, "of the household expenses, every week since, for a while now. I didn't show Papa because I didn't want him to worry." Willa set the jacket down. She looked at the girl. "Can I see it?" June left the room and came back with a small brown notebook, cheaper than Willa's, the kind sold at general stores. She held it out with both hands. Willa opened it. The columns were neat. The categories were logical. The arithmetic was correct. It was the record-keeping of a 12-year-old who had decided that someone needed to be watching, and had done it in the only way available to her, quietly, in a notebook she didn't show anyone. She thought of her own journal on the first night, the $11, the note about the trees and the starting material. Two people, different ages, same instinct. "This is very good," Willa said. She meant it the way she meant things, without ornament. June looked at her hands. "I didn't want things to get worse without anyone knowing. I know." She handed the notebook back. "Keep going with it. You can show your father now if you want to. The numbers are better." June looked up. A quick, direct look, the kind she gave when she was deciding whether something was true before she let herself believe it. Whatever she found in Willa's face apparently satisfied the question, because she nodded once and took the notebook back and held it against her chest. She didn't leave the room. She stayed on the rug and opened her book and read for an hour in the lamplight, and the room was the particular kind of quiet that developed between people who had decided they were comfortable with each other, a decision that required no announcement. Boyd had started leaving the extension bulletins on the kitchen table when he found new ones, which was the closest he came to suggesting she might find them useful. She always had. She left her own notes in the margins sometimes, questions about rootstock or spray timing or the economics of adding a second variety, and she began to find those notes answered, in his hand, when she came back to them. They had a conversation about it once, only once, in the way that people who communicate in parallel will occasionally surface and say the thing directly. He came in from the barn one evening to find her at the desk with 3 years of pruning records spread out and her own notes beside them. He poured coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway. "You're planning the spring pruning," he said. "I'm looking at what the pruning records say about which trees are underproducing and whether the cause is variety, location, or management." She paused. "I'm not trying to tell you how to prune your orchard." "I know," he said. He came in and sat down and looked at the records from the other side of the desk. "What do you see?" She showed him. The underperforming trees in the lower east section, which were pippins but were sitting in the drainage problem she'd identified in November. The 3 trees in the upper northwest corner that were producing at half rate and whose pruning notes showed increasingly aggressive cutting that was probably making the problem worse. He looked at what she showed him, and he asked questions, and he disagreed with 2 of her conclusions and explained why, and she listened and updated one of them, and by the end of the hour, they had a spring plan that was neither hers nor his, but something made from both. She went to bed that night thinking that was the best hour she'd had since she arrived, and she wasn't entirely sure why, except that she had spent most of her adult life working alongside people who didn't particularly want her to know as much as she knew. And this was different, and different was a condition she was still getting used to. The letter from Boyd's father-in-law arrived in December, which was how she learned there was one. Boyd mentioned it at breakfast, not quite casually, in the way he mentioned things that were not casual. "Marianne's father," he said. "He's in Portland. He's been hearing things about the harvest, about the accounts." He set the letter on the table. "He wants to know how the operation is doing. What will you tell him?" Boyd looked at his coffee. He and his father-in-law had, she gathered from the silence around the subject, been in the complicated position of two people who had grieved the same woman differently and hadn't found a way through that difference. The man had not come after Mary Ann died. That was what the silence said. I should have written him sooner, Boyd said. He's June's grandfather, she should know him. He turned the letter over. I've been angry at him. For not coming. For not offering. But I never asked, either, and I don't know if I had the right to be angry about the thing I didn't ask for. Willa was quiet for a moment. Two people can both be right that the other one should have done something differently, she said. That's usually how it works when the people involved are not actually bad people. He looked at her. Write to him, she said. Tell him the harvest went well. Tell him June is doing well. If he asks to come, let him. You wouldn't mind that. She should know him, Willa said again. That's more important than whatever happened between you. He read the letter again. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. She went back to her breakfast. June came downstairs a few minutes later and sat down and ate her eggs without asking what the letter was, which meant she already knew, which meant she had been listening from the hall. Willa kept her face neutral and passed her the bread. It snowed in January, a real snow, the kind that came over the Coast Range, and sat in the valley for a week, and turned the orchard into a white study in geometry, the rows of bare trees casting blue shadows on the ground. Willa stood at the parlor window on the third morning of it, and looked at the branches, and thought about weight distribution, about which limbs were collecting ice and which were letting it slide, about what she would be looking for in the spring in terms of breakage. June appeared beside her. The girl was wearing her school coat over her nightgown, which she would not have done 2 months ago, before she'd decided Willa was someone whose presence in the morning she didn't have to be formal for. Which tree is that? She said, pointing. Third row from the right, maybe the 12th from the bottom, Willa said. I've been watching the way it holds snow. It's loaded heavier on the south side. I think it means the crown is off balance from pruning. June looked at it. Can you fix that? Over a few years. You can't do it fast without taking too much. How long? 3 seasons, if we prune right. June was quiet for a moment. So you'll still be here in 3 seasons. Willa looked at her. June was still looking at the tree. Her face was doing the careful neutral thing she did when she had made a calculation, and was waiting to see if the answer came back wrong. I'm not going anywhere, Willa said. June turned and looked at her directly. The assessment was there, open, direct, the full weight of a child who had been disappointed enough times to have learned how to read sincerity. Whatever she found, she seemed to find it enough. Good, she said. She turned and went back toward the stairs. Boyd was in the kitchen doorway. Willa had not heard him come in. She did not know how long he'd been standing there. His face was doing several things at once, none of which he was going to name out loud, and she did not require him to. She went to put the kettle on. By the time March came and the bare trees began to show the first faint trace of bud, the Straker orchard was different enough from what it had been the previous September that she sometimes had to remind herself she was looking at the same place. The accounts were in order, in a double ledger system she'd instituted in January that Boyd had studied, questioned, and then adopted without ceremony. The equipment debt was paid. The feed debt was paid. There was a reserve, small but real, in the bank account in Copperfield. The town had adjusted its view of her in the way small towns did, not quickly but definitively, in the aggregate of small interactions. The man who ran the feed supply had started asking her questions about spray schedules. The postmaster's wife, who managed the agricultural extension library, had begun setting aside bulletins she thought might be relevant. She was not from here yet, but she was somewhere on the road toward it. June had shown her household notebook to Boyd in February. He had sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time, going through the columns, and his face had been very still in the way that meant something significant was happening behind it. He had closed the notebook and handed it back to his daughter and said, "Your mother would have been proud of this," which was the first time Willa had heard him say her name out loud without the word landing like a stone. June had taken the notebook back and held it against her chest the same way she'd held it in the parlor, and they had sat together for a while, the three of them, in the warm kitchen in February with the snow on the ground outside. The Hood River Cooperative had written back with a spring contract. Boyd had read the terms twice, and then slid it across the desk to Willa and asked what she thought, which was how things had started to work between them. She read it. She marked 2 clauses. They talked about it at breakfast over 2 days. On the 3rd morning, he signed it and she drafted the cover letter. On an afternoon in late March, Willa walked the lower east rows, looking at what the drainage correction they'd done in January had accomplished. It was too early to be certain, but the ground was draining faster than it had last fall, and the root crowns she could see in the soft earth looked clear. The trees stood in the early spring light with a quality that was hard to name. Dormant but ready. The kind of readiness that looked like stillness but wasn't. She heard the gate at the bottom of the row and turned. Boyd was coming up the row toward her, not calling out, just walking, his hands in his coat pockets. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the nearest tree. "Bud's coming," he said. "About 3 weeks to bloom if the weather holds." He looked up the row. "You fixed this section." "We fixed it," she said. "You knew it was draining wrong. I just had time to look at it." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about next year," he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, at an angle, looking at the tree and not at her. "If we expand the upper block by 8 acres, there's good ground on the north face that my father cleared and never planted. We could add another 150 trees over 2 years. The soil's right for it." She looked up at the north face of the hill. She had looked at that section in November and thought the same thing and written it in her notebook. "We'd need to agree on the variety," she said. "The pippins are solid, but the market has room for a second variety if we pick the right one." "Golden Delicious," he said. "The extension's been pushing them for this elevation." "I know. I've been reading the same bulletins." He looked at her then, just for a moment. The look he gave, when the distance he kept as a matter of habit was briefly not there, when whatever was underneath all that careful management let itself be visible for a second. "I figured," he said. "We'd pick the stock together," she said. Something in his expression shifted, small but real. He looked back at the tree. "Together," he said. The afternoon was settling around them, the March light beginning to angle and redden. Up at the house she could see smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant June was home from school and had started the stove. One of the barn cats was sitting on the fence post at the end of the row, watching them with the complete indifference of its species. In 4 months she had gone from $11 and a soft-folded letter to standing in rows of trees that had a future they hadn't had in September. Not a certain future. Nothing out here was certain, but the arithmetic had changed. And changed arithmetic changed what was possible, and what was possible now in this orchard on this hill above Copperfield was a great deal more than it had been the morning. She stepped off the train. She had not come here for this. She had come because she had run out of other options, and a practical letter had arrived with the last of them. She had not known what she was going to find, or whether she was going to be able to be useful, or how long she would stay. You didn't know those things in advance. You only knew them after. What she had found was a place that was not broken so much as it was grieving, a man who had the knowledge and the endurance, but not the angle of view, a child who had been doing a grown-up's job in silence and needed someone to hand it to. The orchard had been there the whole time. The land was good. The trees were sound. It had needed someone to look at it from outside and say this is worth staying for. She had been that person. She had not known that was what she was until she was already doing it. April came. The trees bloomed. She stood at the upper fence on the first full bloom day and looked down at the rows of white flowers going all the way to the bottom of the hill, and the valley below them, and the town in the distance, small and ordinary, and hers, in whatever way a place became yours when you had decided to stop leaving. June appeared at the fence beside her, out of breath, because June still ran between places even when there was no reason to run. She looked at the bloom. "Everyone," June said. "Everyone," Willa agreed. From somewhere below them, Boyd was moving along the bottom row with a long stride, and his hands out, checking the bloom on the lower branches, talking to the trees the way farmers talk to things they'd been tending long enough that the conversation felt natural. He did not know she was watching. She thought she would not tell him. She turned and walked back into the orchard. The trees were blooming. The ground was holding. Somewhere in the lower rows, the barn cat was following Boyd at a careful distance, as though keeping track of something important. The apple harvest was 4 months away. She intended to be there for every day of it.